Everyone.
Yes, me too.
Good afternoon and welcome to the April 9th, 2012 regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee. I'm joined by my colleagues, the Honorable Tony Cardenas and the Honorable Bill Rosendahl, and we're ready to begin. If anybody would like to offer general public comment or comment on any of our agenda items, please fill out one of these white cards and bring it forward. I think what we're going to do is hear general public comment first. We're going to defer the closed session items until after our open session items, and then of course we'll take agenda specific comment as we take up each item. So why don't we go first to general public comment, and right now I have only one card, and that's from Dr. Weissman. So, Dr. Weissman, if you could please come forward. And if anybody else would like to offer general public comment, fill out a card and bring it forward. Dr. Weissman, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm here as an NCAS, NCAS, Neighborhood Council Active Stakeholder. So what I'm saying is a personal...
Dr. Weissman, pull the microphone up a little closer. Thanks.
As a Neighborhood Council Active Stakeholder. So what I'm saying now is just a personal comment. And is not part of any organized program. I've been thinking a bunch of what-ifs. You may have seen something called What If a week or so ago, but what if we could save the city significant amounts of money? Would that induce the city council to restore the $50,000 per year that the neighborhood councils receive? The neighborhood council's been taking the short end of the stick for a long time, and the stick seems to be getting shorter and shorter. But I think we're worth what relatively small piece of the budget we get. And the neighborhood council and the neighborhood councils are about to come to the city. I'll wait. Good morning. Good afternoon.
No, don't wait. Proceed. You've got 2 minutes.
The neighborhood councils are about to come to the city council with their annual white paper or their annual report. It's now the second annual. And it'll include a great deal of savings, a great deal of suggestions, some of which the council members have been thinking of. But what if we could add to that enough to make it worth your while to both accept what we had done, act on what we have done, and restore the $50,000 to the neighborhood councils. I think they're worth it. I think you should think they're worth it. I'd like to see you show that you think they're worth it. And I thank you for your direct attention.
Thank you, Dr. Weissman. Okay. I have no other cards for general public comment, so general public comment is closed. As I mentioned, the closed session items we will defer until the end of the meeting. We will be hearing items 1 and 2 in closed session. Item 3, at the request of the city attorney, is being taken off calendar, so we will not be considering that item in closed session. That brings us to item number 4.
Okay, item number 4 was continued from our April 2nd, 2012 meeting. It's a city attorney report relative to the retention of Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood under a 3-year contract to assist the city attorney's office in negotiating a contract on behalf of the Department of Public Works Bureau of Sanitation for a municipal solid waste alternative treatment facility.
All right, now this item was continued from our last meeting. Mr. Englander had some additional questions, I think, that you wanted to pose. Mr. Englander, have you been satisfied on this matter? And by the way, for the record, we're now joined as well by Councilmember Englander and Councilmember Kretz. We have a full boat here.
Yes.
Mr. Englander.
Yes, I'm satisfied with it in as much as in looking at the contract scope of work agreement does not mention any one particular vendor as it was indicated in the staff report. And so I appreciate you sharing that now. And so, yes, I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So was there anything else that you had to report?
No, unless the committee has any further questions.
You're not allowed.
Okay. Then we had continued this last week, so we can entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to go ahead and accept it.
Okay?
I'll second it.
All right, and without objection, that will be the action of the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to item number 5.
Item 5 is a city attorney report relative to outside council expenditures for the second quarter of fiscal year 2011-12.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Ann Haley is my name. Nice, City Attorney's Office. Nice to see you.
It's a pleasure. Welcome.
And I don't know that there are any questions, but just as by way of introduction, perhaps to you, Councilman Krikorian, we file now quarterly reports that report on the expenditures on outside counsel, and that is the report that is before you today. It's really often received and filed as for informational purposes to alert the council to how much is being expended on outside counsel per quarter. And this is that report for the second quarter.
Members, any questions or concerns on this report?
I just want to know why Public Works is 1.85, that's all.
That would be the Dillingham, well, not to say too much in public, but there's a huge piece of litigation we have that is funded by the Public Works Department because it emanates from that department.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so is the recommendation to just note and file the report? There's no objection to that. That will be the action of the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, that takes us to item number 6, which is a motion per res relative to approval of a fee waiver in amount of $7,259 for the Glamour Gowns 2012 event at the Los Angeles Convention Center.
I don't know if any report is necessary on this. Does anybody have any concerns or questions? Or no. All right. Then,
Funds are identified.
pardon? Want to move this?
The source of the funds are identified, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yep.
I'll move it.
Okay. Without objection, then that will be the action of the committee. That brings us to item number 7.
And item 7 is the city administrative officer's 4th financial status report for fiscal year 2011-12 relative to interim budget adjustment.
So I have 2 cards on number 7. What I would like to do is, no, go ahead. I'd like to hear the report first, then we'll take our comments on this matter, and then we'll have any deliberation that the committee would like to engage in.
Melissa Krantz, Office of the CAO. This is our 4th financial status report. It is an abbreviated report. It consists solely of appropriations and transfers to departments to allow them to continue operations until our year-end financial status report, which is what we project to release by the end of May, early June. In that year-end, we will also update any the status on remaining department deficits, revenue changes, the 4-year outlook, etc. However, in this report, we did want to reiterate that the deficit of $72 million that was previously identified in the second FSR was resolved with the mid-year report and the operational plans. So these transactions, which consist of $50 million in transfers and appropriations, just will allow departments to continue operations. Those transactions are summarized on page 1 and 2 of the report. These include $17 million in new appropriations, $8.3 million in transfers between accounts within departments and funds, $3.7 million for transfers between departments and funds, $5.5 million in appropriations from the unappropriated balance. This includes $500,000 in budgeted funds for the Emergency Management Department, as well as $4 million in appropriations from the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty, which were approved as part of the operational plan. $3 million was for the petroleum shortfall and $1 million for bank fee costs. There's also $954,000 in an appropriation for the Controller's Office for their annual city audit. We also have $5.7 million in decreased appropriations to departments. These decreased appropriations are not expected to affect services because we do have additional sources of funding identified. We also have $8.4 million in reappropriations of special funds and encumbered general funds, so these reappropriations will not affect the general fund. Finally, we are requesting authorization for Office of Finance to spend $383,000 in MICLA funds for the purchase of equipments for their LA tax program. There are greater details on the recommendations in the following sections, as well as the attachments, and if you want to go through that, we can.
Okay, thank you, and we will do that in a moment, but first I'd like to take public comment on this matter. You can stay there, I think, if you just want to move over. I'm sure we're going to have questions for you. The first card I have on this matter is Dr. Weissman, followed by Cheryl Parisi.
Thank you,
Dr. Weissman,
Mr.
welcome.
Moran. The data that we've just been told about, the balancing the budget that we've just been told about, is not entirely what I believe the material is all about. There are 4 encumbrances that have made this possible. Last week, we spoke about the $600 million, which is due in August 12th to pay the last part of the TRAN, and we were assured that it is being collected and set aside. I think that this committee deserves to know where and how it's set aside. It would probably be most appropriate to be set aside in an escrow account so that it could not be commingled with other funds. The unpaid police overtime, which got a lot of news a few weeks ago, is also one of the reasons that we're balanced now, and that comes due on July 1st, 2013. There are labor salary increases, and I believe there are others in the room who will be talking about that, and the contracted COLA increases that are still part of the balancing that needs to be done. But there's a final thing that I'd like to speak of. Each year, as I've been reviewing the cash flow and preparing this material on the TRAN, I've noticed that there's about $100 million in encumbered supplies and about $200 million in encumbered salaries. The encumbered salaries really strikes me as being inappropriate. Salaries are paid right now. An encumbrance is usually a set aside that is in preparation for a bill that isn't going to come due for a while. But those salaries bills come due every 2 weeks. Maybe the supplies could be considered as a true encumbrance, but I'm not so sure about that either, and I think a good explanation is due to this committee for those 4 items, including those encumbrances I just mentioned.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Cheryl Parisi, followed by Pat McCosker. And as of right now, those are the only cards I have, so if anybody else would like to speak on the FSR, please fill out a card and bring it forward. Ms. Parisi, welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I just had a couple of questions or comments that I wanted to raise before the committee as you consider the FSR. The first has to do with the library department. As you are all aware, fiscal year 10-11 deliberations led to the layoff of numerous library workers. And the consequence of that, of course, was the closure of numerous libraries, closure on Mondays, and shortages of hours throughout the department. As a result, Measure L was overwhelmingly passed by the voters of the city of Los Angeles, and so for this fiscal year, there was to be a restoration of service hours. What occurred, and this is really the subject of a pending unfair labor practice charge of AFSCME Librarians Guild against the city of Los Angeles. What occurred is, even though there were librarians and clerical workers who had been laid off from their positions, and the library department, as a result of Measure L, restored the work, the city declined to recall all of those workers to their positions and duties as librarians, and instead elected to utilize as-needed staff. These are non-benefited workers, work less than 1,000 hours a year, to come in and perform the services and duties of librarians. The reason I raised this issue here before you is that it's interesting to note that the library department report notes a $1.05 million surplus in the salaries general account for the library, and ironically asked for a transfer of $5,000 of that to the as-needed account. My question to you as policymakers is that it's very clear that funds were present, are present in the library to be able to restore these workers to their rightful duties and honor their rights and our collective obligations under the city charter. And the use of the as-needed is really a violation of that, and it's now supported by the evidence that there's actual funding in the library department to support the recall of these workers. And I wanted to, if you beg my indulgence, I wanted to just talk about one other issue. Just a question. I noted in the human resource benefits line that there is, as we all are aware, a shortage. There was a shortfall, or excuse me, a decision to not fund $8.1 million of needed revenue to fund the city civilian benefits program. This shortfall was done despite the fact that we negotiated rates with the carriers that were well below medical trend line and adopted a series of copay increases on both office visits and prescription drug to really drive down the cost of the plans. My question is, there is a note in the report that sort of questions the status of this $8.1 million and talks about sort of pending advice from the city attorney. I would just ask that the committee make that whole question, kind of inquire of the city attorney and CAO, what advice are they seeking from city attorney, and what is the status of those funds?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Pat McCosker. If anybody else would like to speak on the FSR, please fill out a card and bring it forward. Mr. McCosker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee members, Pat McCosker, United Firefighters. I notice in this fourth report that there's a $16.4 million fire department shortfall in overtime, it says, and then I don't see any proposal to bridge that gap. Doesn't seem to do anything but kick that can down the road until the end of the fiscal year. And it was just a month or two ago that sitting at one of these seats, the CAO talked about this. You all asked him, well, what's going on, with that? Why is the fire department over budget? And he gave you a tall tale, told you that, well, there have been more retirements than we anticipated. And, when they retire, then we have to put someone in that seat where they worked on an ambulance or a fire truck at overtime, and therefore the costs are going up. I just want you to know that, as I said then, that every time a firefighter retires right now, it becomes a little more efficient to run the fire department with this measly 950 members per day on duty. We only have 950. It's constant staffing, meaning you keep the staffing on duty each day at a constant amount. It's far too low right now. I won't get into that, but 950. Each time a guy retires, we get closer to the sweet spot. And there's a very good CAO report written by Bill Fujioka from 2007, I think, that actually finally explained for you all what we've always understood about our very complicated staffing, model, constant staffing. And it says that the sweet spot, the balance between the number of firefighters that you all hire and employ and the number of seats you fill, the sweet spot is between no vacancies and about 100 field vacancies. And that, in other words, you shouldn't start hiring again until you get to 101 vacancies on the fire department. That's the point at which it's more costly to use overtime. Well, we're nowhere near that right now. We actually don't have any vacancies. We have an overage. We have pools in every rank. So don't believe this baloney about, it's the firefighters and their overtime. Every time a guy retires, it becomes more efficient. So I urge you to fund that and not allow at the end of the fiscal year that to be used against us again. You can bet that we'll be reading in the paper about all the overtime that firefighters somehow wrested from the city. Please fund the fire department fully. It was underfunded to begin with. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the cards I have on this matter, so that will close public comment on item 7. And colleagues, open it up to you. Mr. Englander.
Are you going to go through which departments we wish to? What was the protocol? Do you want to follow the last? It
was a little more robust last time, but we can do that. Yeah. Why don't?
Chair, if you want. I mean, there's a room full.
Yeah, you're right. Why don't we do that so that people don't have to wait around in case there's...
That was great how you did that.
Yeah.
Just taking one from your playbook, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for keeping me on
So the discussion section begins on page 11.
That's a good question. All right. So why don't we go through that and just call out the departments that you're interested in asking questions about.
Okay.
And if there are any that no one is interested in asking questions about, folks can get back to work.
Okay, I've got a question for EMD, Fire Department, LAPD, and then the Bureau of Street Services, I have a question for, but I could probably, if the CAO can maybe answer it for me, that would be great. So EMD, Fire, LAPD, and Street Services.
Did we just want to go by one committee member at a time, or do you want to?
No, we want to get the full, list here first. Any departmental questions? Mr. Kratz?
I have, let's see, a fire question, a general services question, and a done question.
Services.
I'll start. So EMD,
Library issue.
Fire.
See what Cheryl was saying, we'd like to ask them to respond to what she said. Also, fire is another one.
Library. Okay.
Okay. Any others? Okay, so that, I think some of my questions might
So
have
I have
been-
EMD, Fire, GSD, Library, Neighborhood Empowerment, Police, and Street Services.
Yes,
EMD,
that's correct.
Okay.
Fire, General Services, Library, Neighborhood Empowerment, Police, Street Services. That was it?
That was it.
Okay, Emergency Management is on page 12.
No, before you proceed, if there are any departments here that we didn't just mention, thank you very much for coming. You don't need to stick around. You're welcome to, but you don't need to if you don't want to, because we won't be asking any questions about your departments.
Unless we think again, so might as well leave.
Get out.
Get out while the getting's good.
Well, you can.
Exactly.
All
Okay,
right.
so why don't we start with the department-specific questions, and we'll just go
Okay.
through department by department then,
Oh, you want to go through department by department?
the ones that we just mentioned.
Yes.
Okay,
So,
okay. Emergency
EMD.
Management is on page 12. And we do have one recommendation for them. That's to appropriate $500,000 from the UB for the, to the Emergency Operations Fund. And this was money that was budgeted for the city disaster planning study. The department is expected to complete the year within budget, assuming that they receive the Regional Catastrophic Preparedness Grant Program appropriations.
Okay, Mr. Englander.
Thank you. I understand that we already have a contractor on board for this, ready to go.
Good afternoon. Anna Burton with the Emergency Management Department. Via the court order that was released in November and then subsequent actions, the court has directed that we contract with Baptist Child and Family Services from Texas. We are currently negotiating the contract and the scope of work for that, and the funds, the $500,000 transfer, will go directly towards that contract.
So my question on the scope of work and the actual, what they're going to be doing in terms of that scope, has that been approved by another committee? Has that gone, or will that be once we transfer this funds to go ahead and enter into the contract?
The actual scope of work is being based specifically on, and working with the city attorney, what the court has directed us to do within the timeframes that the court has directed us, which is 36 months that began in November. So working with Baptist, BCFS, the acronym that they refer themselves to, will be making sure that what they bill for can actually accomplish what the court has directed. And we'll be reporting, quarterly to make sure that that meets the judge's stipulations.
But have we gone through an actual approval process of the judge's stipulations? Because we still have, I don't recall that there's been council action taken to proceed on implementing specific objectives.
No, the scope of work has not been brought to any of the council committees nor the full council.
I'm sorry, but my question is, nor will it once we approve this funding. It's just approved and done, and then you can go ahead and enter into the contract and begin the work once signed off by a city attorney. Is that correct?
Correct. It's my understanding that as soon as the city attorney approves the scope of work, the contract will not in any way be brought back to the council.
So that's my only concern. So if there's any way this has not gone to any committee, and so I wanted to make sure that what we're doing, I mean, we're the ones actually ultimately accountable to it, that we're fulfilling the objectives of what the court had instructed. I mean, I'm okay with approving it, but the funds, but not the program, because we haven't seen the program, and has not come back, nor will it, to any committee or council for approval. And so I'm
I just
asking.
left another meeting with those two city attorneys, and I'm sure they're at their desk, and we can have them come and speak if you take another department out of turn.
It's really, I don't think, so much a city attorney question, because the city attorney's dealing is in resolving the issues in the litigation, and the funding goes to that. But I think what Mr. Englander is asking for is a report back to the council through its appropriate policy committees about the underlying policy objectives themselves.
Appreciate that. Right. Exactly it. So if we could approve, I wouldn't mind approving the funds, but that's subject to going to the appropriate committee for overview in terms of the scope and to ensure that we're in compliance with what the court is asking us to do. And that's what I would ask. We can go ahead and move it out of this committee in terms of the financial obligation, but move it into a policy committee to discuss the scope of work and the contract, so the city council can approve that in its totality. That's what I would ask.
Not the contract, but the
scope of work. And right, the city attorney will approve the contract. The funds will be approved from the budget committee, from this committee, but the actual work being performed would be approved out of a policy committee to ensure we're in compliance with what we should be doing.
The implementation of whatever the recommendations may be, is that?
Yes.
That it makes sense to me, although that's not so much a budget and finance question.
Right, but it's not scheduled for another committee. And so, if we could refer it to the appropriate committee, that's what I would suggest.
I feel as though it might be a little bit outside of the scope of what's agendized before us right now, but...
Council members, what you might be able to do is just go ahead and approve this recommendation, but add an additional recommendation to have that contract or scope of work come back to the council, and then that would be referred to the appropriate committee.
Right. But that's what I would do.
Okay. I'll second that.
Yeah.
Without objection. That'll be part of the recommendation.
Okay.
Anything else?
That was
Anybody else have anything else on emergency management? Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next department is Fire Department. That's on page 14. They do have a $16.4 million deficit that was identified previously. This deficit has been resolved per the operational plan. We had identified funding. The transfer is just not recommended because they will not be needing those funds till the end of the year. So when that comes, it will be included in the year-end FSR. We have transfers in this report to partially resolve any immediate shortfalls that they have in that account to make that funding available for that spending. In this FSR, we do have some transfers of $311,000 from the sworn account to the unused sick time account to meet payroll needs through pay period 25. We have a transfer of $60,000 from the department's special training fund to the police department so that the police department may provide pilot training to the fire department employee. We have a transfer of $25,000 in MICLA funds to ITA to install equipment. And this funding was previously approved for spending in the second FSR of the previous year. And finally, we have an appropriation of $280,000 to the variable staffing overtime account to enhance ambulance availability during peak hours citywide. This is only a partial funding of the total estimated cost, which is $375,000. However, additional funding should be made available by the end of the fiscal year.
Mr. Rosendahl.
Yeah, hi. I want to know about the $375,000 for additional ambulances, and it is a question from me. I was just told the other day that an ambulance, there was none up in the Palisades 69, and to get one there took 11 minutes. I don't know the details because they haven't shared with me. It was a life-threatening moment. It was an ambulance they needed. Will having 6 more ambulances give me some comfort in the Pacific Palisades that we will have an ambulance there and not have to wait 11 minutes to get one there? Unless someone can help explain to me what happened in the Palisades, I certainly am pitching that the Palisades, besides I want my engine company back there for obvious reasons, what about the ambulance service?
Councilman, I don't have the particulars on that incident. If you want to forward them, I have your staff contact me. I'll look into it. Deputy Chief Darren Palacios, Fire Department. We're looking right now. We're finalizing logistical where we're going to be able to get the ambulances should this pass and go through. We're going to finalize where they're going to go. So at this point, we do need to know there is a need in the west side. We will be getting, there'll be improved coverage in that area that you talk about in the west side.
Because it's a serious problem for me. It's all about the traffic gridlock we have that makes things difficult, because we had another incident on Cantor, which needed a fire truck, and there was no fire truck because it was in somebody else's district, and that was 11 minutes. 2 houses burnt down on that. So I'm just looking at having enough resources for the safety of my constituents. Do you know anything about that one on Cantor?
No, I do not.
Could you look into that as well?
Yes, I
So
will.
those are the two I'd like to get some information on, because I'm hearing 11 minutes in both. I'm hearing one was a structure fire that went to a second house because there was no engine company to that. And then obviously in the Palisades, there was no ambulance, period. And it took 11 minutes to get there. It'd be helpful. to
I'll
me.
contact your staff.
Thank you very
With
much.
particulars back to you. Mr. Kretz.
It's, I'm happy about the addition of the variable staffing overtime used to staff the 6 additional ambulances. I think that's at least a step in the right direction. But just informationally, what is the special fund for 4R that money is coming from?
This is money from Kaiser. Maybe the fire department can elaborate on that.
The Kaiser Fund is a fund that is set up for
Your name for the record?
Mark Davis from the CAO's office. The Kaiser Fund is set up, Kaiser Permanente, they have an agreement with the fire department to reimburse and to pay the city for the transports for their patients to a Kaiser facility.
Right, what we do is basically Kaiser, it costs them a lot of money to transfer. If we take to the closest ER, they have to take that patient and transfer them to there, and it costs them more money. So what we do is we consider their requests and the patient's condition, and if we are able to take them to Kaiser, we transport to the Kaiser. That would save them money. Therefore, we have a fund, and in that fund, we buy AEDs and different parts of equipment and different things that can improve our delivery of service. It's not really a renewable type of one that we can rely upon for every year, but we have funds in there now. At the end of the year, they just made a payment that came in, so we worked with the CAO's office to be able to spend this money to better and put these 6 ambulances on the street.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, it's not a renewable fund? What's it based on?
Well,
Is
it's
it based on a contractual arrangement of some kind?
Yes, we have a contract with them, an MOU. It's renewable, but I would not suggest that you sustain these for staffing for an ambulances.
But what's the formula for determining how much we realize?
I think what it is basically, as the chief had mentioned, basically it's a contract where if they pick up a patient and there's not a life-threatening type situation, instead of going directly to the closest ER, they will stabilize the patient and then go to the closest Kaiser facility, and then there's a reimbursement process by Kaiser. That money goes into this fund. So it all depends on
a per transport basis.
Exactly.
So it's going to fluctuate somewhat depending on how many patients are transported, how many Kaiser patients are transported.
Kaiser, yes.
But we're pretty safe in expecting that there's going to be some range of number of patients. I mean, as big a provider as Kaiser is,
Yes.
There's going to be a sort of a minimum number that we could reliably count on each year.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Englander.
Yes, no, thank you, I appreciate it. So, I had some same questions on that relative to the 6 staffed ambulances. How many ambulances are we short right now citywide?
Well, if we went back to the prior 07-08, we're 4 ambulances short of that. And that would be full-time ambulances, not V-staff.
Okay, so we're 4 after the 6.
Right now, we're 4 short of what we had then. So if you put the 6 back, you'll be 2 over, but actually, these are V-staff. What we closed were 4 24-hour ambulances. What we're putting back is 6 10-hour ambulances.
Okay, so it doesn't give us 2 over. We're actually still under because they're not 24-hour. They're,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Okay. So, with that, we're using what you called one-time money to fund for the next 3 months, the 6 ambulances, part-time, and we're not sure yet where they're going to go. There's no deployment plan yet for those?
No, pending this, we should be able to, we're finalizing the plan. We saw this on the budget. We worked with the chief. He was out of town last week. He's back in town. We should have an answer in the next few days. If this does pass, we hope to implement it or prepared to implement them on the pay period beginning 4/22.
And how long have we been getting the Kaiser money? How long has that agreement been in place?
I'm not sure. That's been going on for quite a few years.
Quite a few years?
But traditionally, it has been used to fund the paramedic training, the equipment and supplies that aren't funded as part of the budget.
Okay, so defibrillators, et cetera, supplies and specialized trainings.
Correct.
And if we've been using that historically every year since we've had this, does that mean we're not going to be funding some of that equipment needs and specialized training in the last 3 months now?
Some of that will get deferred, yes.
Some of that will be deferred? So I'm just trying to figure out if there's some kind of policy decision that's being made. I don't know that it's a bad one. I'm just trying to understand what the ramifications are. If we add something, we give something up. And where this came from, not knowing yet what the deployment plan is yet in place, what this is going to do to change the system. We're putting back 6 ambulances half-time as opposed to the 4 full-time we're missing. But it's only over the next 3 months. We haven't yet seen what next year's budget's going to bring with one-time money. And so my concern is, what are we giving up? Is this a full year's budget on this, or is just this 1 quarter of the revenue? Or what portion is the Kaiser money? That it appears that's $280,000. Oh, no, that's coming from the variable staffing. It's $375,000 out of the Kaiser. Is that for the full year or a partial year?
We're taking $280,000 from it to partially fund it. I don't have the figure here on how much that traditionally brings in. That number, I
If
picked
I,
it for you.
if I seem to recall, that fund fluctuates from about $250,000 up to $500,000. Here again, it all depends on the number of transports.
A year.
They do it, yeah, per year.
For a
Yeah.
year. So this is about probably the whole year?
It's probably, getting close.
So when this comes to council, I'm assuming this is scheduled tomorrow?
No, we're not scheduled till the following week.
Following week?
Yep.
Can you bring back a report on what was identified, where this money was originally set to go, in terms of, just so we know that we're voting on and supporting the transfer of the funds, the use of the 6 ambulances, but we're also then going to be supporting canceling of or eliminating particular equipment needs or training that would have been used. So I just want to know, I don't want to wake up one day, 2, 3, 4 months from now, and saying, we didn't have this ability to have this training or this equipment needs, where we have traditionally and always used the Kaiser money for it because we knew it was one-time money. We're putting folks in place also for only 3 months, also not knowing if they're going to stay there 3 months from now, if that's part of the budget or not, coming from the mayor. And I think this was originally done, was this done by a council motion, or was this done by executive order? Was this where did the idea come from? Where did this initiate, to put the 6 ambulances back for the last 3 months?
I think there's been discussion by the chief, certainly by members of council. We felt, given, the department being down 4 full-time, 24-hour, that using this one-time money, knowing that we're going to have a further conversation about fire in general as we go forward once we receive the mayor's budget, that it would be prudent for the city to at least get some 6 variable staffed ambulance, at least in the peak hours, those 10 hours, and provide some additional service out there to the public.
Okay. So hopefully, when this comes back to council, we have some of those answers. My concern also is that as soon as the budget comes out, if it looks like not only these are sustainable, but perhaps there's even further cuts, then it won't be the council cutting these 6, it'll be cutting, if there was only 3, say, on the cutting list, then it would be 9 that the council would actually be cutting, because these wouldn't be continued. So that's what I'm trying to figure out going forward.
The sustainability of...
Sustainability,
Yes.
this is always a good thing to do, certainly to put ambulances back in, but just so we do it,
The long-term perspective, yeah.
and it's transparent, and everybody understands, and the public understands exactly what we're doing, so, and what we're giving up to do it as well.
Sure.
And I think that's a helpful discussion to have. I guess I would take a little bit of issue in calling this one-time money, though. It's variable, but that doesn't make it one time. I mean, our sales tax revenues are variable every year, too, but those aren't one-time revenues. So as long as we know that there's a continuing relationship with Kaiser and there's going to be some number of patients that are transported, it is a continuing source of revenue of an unknown amount. And so, as long as we can get a fairly conservative estimate of what the minimum will be, we know that at least that ongoing revenue stream is perfectly appropriate to spend on ongoing expenses as well, it seems to me. But you're perfectly right, Mr. Englander, I think, in saying that if we're displacing some other expenditure, the council ought to know what those priorities are that we're choosing among.
Yes.
Mr. Cardenas, did you have any question for fire?
Not for that.
Anything further, gentlemen? If I might, specific to this issue on ambulances, I don't think we're out of order if we ask Mr. McCosker to just comment on the ambulance issue specifically.
I really appreciate that. I didn't see anything about ambulances in the 4th report. I guess this, and by the way, I think the answer to the question about where this came from isn't that it came from the fire chief. I think it's that it came from the mayor. The mayor said, just the day before your last Public Safety Committee meeting, we're going to do something about this, and I want 6 ambulances. And so now the fire chief is saying something very different about ambulances than he said a year ago when he said, I don't need them, cut them, take them. That's what the mayor had him say then, and now he's saying, I need 6 ambulances, and I'm glad you picked up on the fact that they're V-staffed or part-time ambulances. Please don't take any half measures. We need to restore the fire department. You need ambulances back. And nobody's the great Karnak. They don't know at what hours of the day the call is going to come in your district. We need 24-hour resources. We are a standing army that goes out on 1,000 emergencies every day in Los Angeles. Take whatever course of action, and I think Councilmember Englander is sort of onto it. Take whatever course of action best gets us back to a fully staffed fire department. I don't believe that the best course of action is responding to the mayor's face-saving measure on 6 part-time ambulances right now. Please.
Okay.
But let's come up with a plan. And by the way, you have several motions before you. I appreciate Council Member Koretz's motion for the rest of the year. I appreciate the other motion that's before you right now to actually restore full-time 6 ambulances right now and to have a plan in place for the full restoration of the fire department. Do one of those more concrete things, if you would, please. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. That brings us to General Services.
We'll get a report back, right?
I think they...
I have it written down that we want to request back.
Excuse me, sorry, but Mr. Rosendahl just had a question. I had understood the department to represent to you that they will be reporting back to you about the 2 incidences.
I'm assuming that, right?
Yes, I mean, if I just
So
have it
that's for the
correctly,
department.
how was the money supposed to be used?
Wait, 1 second, please. 1 second. That was a question for the department to report back to Mr. Rosendahl about the 2 incidences that he had asked about as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. General Services.
General
Go right ahead.
Services expected to complete the year within budget, excluding petroleum costs. We had identified a $9 million deficit. With the mid-year report, we partially funded that, which to $6 million. They have another $3 million recommended for transfer in this report, and that should fully fund that deficit at this time. We also have a recommendation to transfer $165,000 from sanitation to reimburse the cost of postage for wastewater program rate adjustment mailings.
All right. Now, the controller recently, of course, announced her audit of petroleum use, and had significant concerns, raised significant concerns about the accountability of petroleum expenditures. Have you factored in those recommendations in making her audit recommendations and making this $3 million recommendation? How do they relate to one another?
The recommendation does not take that into account. This is this deficit was identified before the controller's audit report came out. This deficit is based on current fuel costs and assuming current usage.
Okay, so, all right.
Yes, Renee V. Augustine with General Services. Yes, GSD is currently reviewing and evaluating the controller audit and will be providing a written response shortly. We are not, however, not prepared to officially comment on the audit today.
All right. So given the fact that there have been concerns raised by the city's controller about $7 million in petroleum expenditures by General Services, would it be prudent to defer consideration of this $3 million appropriation until we at least have a handle on what it is that the issues were that were raised, and let the department have an opportunity to respond to the issues that were raised?
My understanding is that there's an SMS control deadline to, have funds available to make these purchases before we, begin year-end closing of the financial system. And GSD would probably be able to answer about how long they could wait until they need to make that purchase. As for the $7 million, I believe that figure was a multi-year figure, and I'm not too sure of what that is, how that would impact just this current year shortfall, which is $9 million.
Yes, the funding is still needed to meet the operating and fueling needs of the city. There is a deadline in June, and we need to encumber the funding so that way we can make the appropriate payments to the fueling vendor.
Colleagues, who called General? Mr. Kress.
Yeah, it seems like every FSR, the General Services budget is over for fuel costs. Is there some way we either can get fuel at a lower cost or budget at a more appropriate level so we're not always short on that end?
Yes, we work very closely with the CAO's office when preparing that budget, and obviously this year has been quite different, where the fuel pricing has increased, and it has been very volatile this year. So that's the reason why the fuel deficit is so great.
Yeah, I don't know that those numbers are shockingly surprising. I mean, the fuel costs seem to continually go up. I don't know if we should be anticipating that in our calculations so that we don't always get caught under. I mean, clearly we're doing something wrong if we're caught under every quarter. So I would hope that we would take a more conservative approach to fuel costs, recognize that we're in a volatile world and this is probably going to continue to go up, and try to track it accordingly.
Yep, we had, when we put the budget together, I think we only had $4 million in the UB, and we usually decide some, hoping that we'll get some flexibility, and we'll actually see some price declines. But obviously in the current year, prices have shot up, and certainly as we go forward, we'll be looking to add funding for the budget. 'Cause I certainly don't think prices are going to be coming down anytime soon.
Well, what are the assumptions that are used in budgeting fuel costs? What assumption is relied upon for average fuel cost over the course of the coming year, the fiscal year?
Oh, yeah.
Well, we certainly look at the fuel usage and the fuel consumption from the previous fiscal year as our benchmark, and projecting the budget for the next fiscal year, and the fuel usage and what the environmental factors that come with the increases in fuel costs, i.e. the trends that are associated with the increases in fuel pricing.
No, I guess specifically, I mean, it's easy enough to figure out based on last year's benchmarks what your anticipated mileage is going to be and so on, and what the number of gallons utilized will be. But what assumption does the city use in budgeting the total amount spent? What assumption is applied for fuel cost, for per gallon fuel cost? because that is the most volatile part of this calculation. It's very difficult to determine whether fuel costs are going to go up or down in a given year.
Yes, you're correct, Councilman, where the volatility is very great in the fuel pricing. What we try to do is we look at the trends from the previous fiscal years of what the fuel prices were and what we project them to be. We take an average costing of that fuel pricing, and we come up with an average fuel price for that year. We also put in some contingencies associated with increased consumption. Usually, we try to build in a factor of about 5%. But again, projecting fuel pricing and the volatility of that is, it's very difficult.
Is there some, and I open this question up to anybody who might know, is there some nationally accepted benchmark for what fuel price should be budgeted at? Every governmental entity in America makes the same calculation. There must be some standard of practice by which we make an estimate of what a gallon of gas is going to cost 8 months from now. Isn't there? Or do we just make it up?
Well, we certainly look at what the industry analysts are looking at, and what we look at is the oil service index, which we follow. And we try to come up with the best projections that we can, but unfortunately, because with the volatility, it's very difficult.
No, I know, and believe me, I'm not directing this at you. I mean, just generally, nationally, everybody does this. The federal government, 50 states, every city, every county has to make the same budget assumption, I mean, we can't all be making it up independently and just guessing about what gasoline's going to cost. There must be some benchmark for this. Isn't there? Hello? Anybody? Mr. Cardenas?
Mr. Chairman,
How did you do it when you were budget chair in Sacramento, Mr. Cardenas?
actually, I learned more about this when I was chair of the committee that oversaw general services, and we had detailed discussions and reports on the volatility and the variables on how do we calculate or figure out how much we're going to spend on fuel in the city. And it's not just for vehicles. We're talking about helicopters. We're talking about across the board of fuel. And the city of Los Angeles, believe it or not, is actually seen as one of the better government agencies that actually predicts and figures it out. But as was mentioned earlier, the variable that caused it to go over this time wasn't so much the number of gallons used. It was just the fact that the prices had stayed high rather than going up and down and averaging out at a lower rate. It just, they've averaged out at a higher rate than anybody could have anticipated, the average. Obviously, everybody knows it can go to $4 or maybe above 4 and below $3.80 or what have you, but the average has been higher than we've ever seen. So all I can tell you is in this discussion today, I was just reflecting on all the discussions we had in GSD over this about 7 or 8 times when I was the chairman. And the bottom line is, it seems that was the one factor that made us go over budget, the anticipated budget. However, I can understand how the staff doesn't want to give any predictions or what have you, because that variable, once again, is the variable that nobody can control. We can, department by department, try to get people to use less, use more efficient means other than using vehicles or what have you, that we have some little bit of control over. But that's the one that the department can't answer for. It's the best I can tell you. But we've had these discussions over and over in detail in written reports, and then going over how they arrive at their dollar amounts. And it's deja vu, but in this discussion, but that one variable was the variable that took us over. Just the fact that prices have averaged much, much higher than anybody anticipated. And we do buy in bulk. I mean, but certainly most hedgers aren't going to buy in bulk today, because right now it's higher than most people like to pay. And when it goes down, we end up jumping in the market and buying in bulk.
Okay.
It hasn't gone down.
But I'm not mistaken, you guys have done some group purchasing over the years too, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Anything else? Colleagues for general services?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, the next department is library. They do have a surplus in their salaries general account of $1.24 million, which will be used to offset shortfalls in their as-needed and transportation account. They also have a shortfall in library fund revenue, currently at $650,000. The last projection is that that might reach $840,000 by year end, and that is attributed to a decreased revenue from fees and fines. We have 2 transfers recommended in the report. That's $125,000 to the salaries as needed account and $5,000 to the transportation account.
Yeah, I put this on there basically to hear a response to Cheryl Parisi's comments and public comment about the libraries, if you could help us with that.
I'm sorry, Kyle Milliger, business manager for the library department. I wasn't here to hear all of Ms. Parisi's comments, but I just wanted to address the $1.2 million surplus that we do have this year is being offset by that revenue reduction of about $839,000. When we put our budget together for the current fiscal year, Measure L provided us $11.7 million additional dollars this year. 55% of that, or roughly $6 million, went toward related costs, which left us about $5 million to add the services for Measure L. 4.3 million of that was just the wages and count increases for the current existing staff that we currently have. About $2 million of that went for the add back of services, which only left us the ability to hire the as-needed staff.
Mr. Chair, if I could I ask Ms. Parisi to do her question again since she was on her way up and didn't?
If you want to provide further comment, Ms. Parisi, you're welcome to. I mean, in a nutshell, what it was, and I'll paraphrase and tell me if I've got it right, but that Measure L provided additional funding that was to have been used to restore work, and that as that work was restored, laid-off librarians weren't necessarily being brought back to perform that work, but rather it was sometimes given to as-needed employees. And Ms. Parisi mentioned that that was the basis of an unfair labor practices claim. So I don't know to what extent we want to engage in a back and forth about the legal details of that, but if you can provide some comment on that. Did I paraphrase that fairly accurately? Okay, thank you.
The layoffs that occurred during that fiscal year 09-10 affected 24 civil service employees for the library. There were 15 librarians and 9 clerk typists, civil service employees that were laid off. We have gone through the managed hiring committee approval process, and we have received permission and approval to hire 12 of those back, 6 librarians, 6 clerk typists. They have all been hired back. Of the 24 laid off, we only have 1 additional person that wanted to come back. The 12 plus the 1 is 13. 11 of them did not want to come back to the city. So we have 1 more that we do anticipate hiring next year.
Okay.
Good for me.
Thank you. Colleagues?
Thanks.
Anything further on the library? Mr. Kretz? Thank you very much.
Okay, the
that
next-
brings us to neighborhood empowerment.
Right. That is on page 16. The department is projected to complete the year within budget. We do have several recommendations for reappropriations, mostly to pay outstanding demand warrants, and I'll defer reading them all. There's quite a few there.
And I believe there might be a motion to actually include another transaction similar to those that are included in our report.
Yes, that is correct. That's why I pulled this. There's a similar appropriation for the South Robertson Neighborhood Council. And I'd like to move that we reappropriate $5,000 from uncommitted prior year funds, Dunn Fund number 44B/47, account number 471046, South Robertson Neighborhood Council, to fiscal year 2011-2012, Dunn Fund 44B/47, account number 471046, South Robertson Neighborhood Council, to pay an outstanding demand warrant to Soro Incorporated.
We were supportive of the motion. I believe there's also a motion and a council file on it as well. This is basically an additional 5,000 to pay a demand warrant from the previous.
And this is taken from their previous rollover funds, or what's the source of the funds?
On February 18th, 2010, the council voted to eliminate the rollover policy, but due to the outstanding fiscal crisis, that policy is in place. But near the closing of that fiscal year, Dunn encumbered funds for each neighborhood council, and some were incorrectly not processed and were missed among 600 requests for demand warrants, and so this one was just misplaced among them.
Okay.
And so we asked that, among other very similar motions, that this one be included.
Okay. If you're moving that, Mr. Kretz, I'll second it without any objection. That'll be the action of the committee as well. Thank you. Any other questions for neighborhood empowerment? No. Okay. Thank you. All right. That brings us to LAPD.
Okay, with the police department, their projected deficit was eliminated with the full implementation of the department's operational plan. They do have an update on their hiring. Their payroll is about $9,917. We do have some transfers recommended. There's a $4 million transfer from the sworn salary account to the salaries general account to offset a projected shortfall in that account. And then we also have a transfer of $1.8 million. The report erroneously says $1.2 million, but that's $1.8 million from department accounts to the field equipment expense account for necessary purchases, including DNA consumables and vehicle parts. There is also a recommendation within the mayor's office section to transfer $4.2 million in supplemental law enforcement services funds to the police department's sworn salaries account.
What is the supplemental law enforcement services fund usually used for?
Frontline police, Laura Luna, Command Officer Fiscal Operations. It's supposed to be used for frontline police officer salaries.
It is a salary account.
It can be used for frontline, yes. It can be used for frontline. It can be used for salaries. It can be used for overtime. It can be used for a number of things, but it has to be for police officers.
What's the source of that money?
I think it comes through the state.
Comes through the state.
It's a state COPS grant.
Okay. Mr. Englander?
Yes, thank you. Just running through the report here, the first paragraph here has the $1.2 million for the pending department's documentation of sworn overtime costs from the UB on economic uncertainties. I'm assuming that means Occupy LA?
That is correct.
Okay. And so those numbers are still being put together, from my understanding. You've got some rough drafts, and those will be forthcoming shortly.
That's correct.
Okay. So there's no transfer being asked for?
No, that it's still a pending appropriation.
Oh, right. It's still pending. It's not actually in the report to be recommended for transfer. On the second bullet point, though, it's got a transfer of another $1.2 million, the exact same amount, from various department accounts to the field equipment expense account for necessary purchases, including DNA consumables and vehicle parts. Are these two related?
No, actually, that amount should be $1.8 million. It is correct on the attachment.
Oh, it's $1.8 million.
Correct.
So I almost saved the city $6 million, or $6 million, I should say.
Almost.
Okay.
Almost.
$1.8 million. And what are DNA consumables?
It's the reagents that they use when they're doing the DNA testing. It's the chemicals that they have to use.
Oh, the chemicals for those.
Yeah.
And how I know this isn't a status report on the DNA cases, so I won't get into that. And then vehicle parts, do we have a, obviously we're not buying more vehicles now, so we're having to purchase more replacement parts, more maintenance, is that correct?
That's correct.
That's why we're looking at that? I see, okay. I think those are really the only questions that I had.
Okay.
That's why, thank you very much.
Colleagues, anything further for police? Okay, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
That brings us to street services.
Yes, street services is on page 18. They do have a deficit right now, $4.69 million for the salaries general account, but they expect to address that through interim appropriations and reimbursements. We also have some recommendations in the report. There is an appropriation of $461 million, and then the rest of the recommendations are reappropriations of special project funds to the department to allow them to complete projects. Finally, the last recommendation is a reduction in traffic safety fund appropriations in the amount of $645,000 in the salaries general account to mitigate any cash shortfalls in the fund. That fund revenues declined from $13.1 million projected in revenue to $11 million in projected revenue. DOT does not anticipate any negative impacts from this action.
Mr. Englander?
Oh, yes, just two quick things on the street damage restoration fee, page 21 at the bottom, number C, street damage restoration fee.
I'm sorry, were you looking? I missed that.
Page 21.
Page 21?
Street damage.
Okay.
Number C,
Yes.
which is the street damage restoration fee?
Yes.
Where does that come from?
Revenue to that fund is received from fees that the city charges when typically utility companies do excavations and on paved streets.
And do we have,
I'm sorry, Stacy Sosa, CAO.
nice that we found it.
I'm always good at that.
Thank you very much. And the fee we charge is supposed to be used for,
For street resurfacing and repair.
so they'll charge a utility, I'm just not familiar with this account.
So they charge the utility companies based on the size of the cut that they're doing on the street, and the intent is that they're cutting the street, so we take money to put back towards repairing streets because they make the cuts, and it interferes with the integrity of the street.
So, but the funds aren't necessarily used to repair that street that they just cut
No.
into? And do they and do the funds cover inspectors to go out to inspect that particular street?
The revenue that's received to this fund does not cover that.
Okay, so this fund just supplements our ongoing street efforts citywide?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. That was the only question I had on that. And then the other question, I appreciate that, that was on the, because I've got a motion in right now to try to go after a lot of the utilities that do shoddy work. And so it helps to know that there's funds they're paying into, but they're
Yes,
used for
and
something else.
the way the
That's
fee
a
is
little separate.
calculated is it's based on the size of the cut, so the larger the cut.
If we know they're actually going out to cut,
Mhm.
because now there's a lot of fees we're probably not collecting.
And then it's also based on the age of the street, so the newer the street, then the more expensive the fee will be.
We're finding that majority of the time, they don't instruct contract administration or let them know they're actually going out to perform the work. In fact, they're supposed to tag the street with a metal tag to show when they did the work, an identifying mark, and go, so we can go out and find out and hold them accountable to do good work, who did it. And I don't know when the last time anybody saw one of these metal tags was, but that's another motion for another committee. So on this, then, my other question was on transportation on page 20. Under the following transactions are recommended. The first, let's see here, the appropriate $376,000 from the ADSAC trust fund for the following. It says $2,500 for overtime charges. And then if you go 1, 2, 3, 4 bullets down, there's another transfer, $2,500 for overtime worked on ADSAC trust fund workers. Is that a duplicate, or is it $5,000, or is it just in there twice?
Well, the one's an appropriation and the other one's a transfer, so they are different transactions.
They are different.
That's correct.
They're just broken up separately.
Correct.
One's appropriation, administration.
Okay. And is that in error as well? I mean, are they supposed to be duplicates? Not that this is a lot of money, but everything's a lot of money at this today, so.
Well, when you create an appropriation within a fund, and the department cannot expend directly from that fund, they can only expend from Fund 100, so you need a corresponding.
Oh, I see.
So it could have
they
been
created
worded
the appropriation,
differently.
and then
Yeah.
they created it later on and put it further down to transfer the money in.
Now, whether that's for the same work orders, I can't tell you that. I can look into that and get back to you on.
That's okay.
All right.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, anything further on street services? I think that was the last department, wasn't it?
We did.
Put in your list?
EMD, LAPD, fire, streets, GSD.
Okay, let's put it this way.
Library. We did library.
We did library.
Yep.
Any further questions, colleagues, on the FSR? Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
So,
Okay, that was to take us, that's the end of the open session, and that would take us to items 1 and 2, which are for closed session.
And
I
for
guess
the
we actually
record,
have to have an action, though, on the FSR.
Yes, yeah. Recommend approval.
So we entertain a motion.
As amended.
To approve the CAO's recommendations.
Yeah, as
And that's
amended.
going to be with the modifications we came up.
As amended, yes, exactly.
As amended.
As amended.
As amended.
Without objection, that will be the action of the committee. We will now take, if there's any, No, we're not in closed session yet. If there's any public comment on any of the closed session items, you may come forward and fill out a card now. If there is no public comment for those items, public comment on those items is now closed, and we will retire to closed session again. These will be on items 1 and 2. Item 3 is taken off calendar and will not be heard in closed session today. So if you were not here, we'll take item number 1 first. If you're not here on item 1, I need to ask you to please leave the room. Item 3 is off calendar. It will not be heard in closed session, so we are now back in open session. We don't need to report out, do we? So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you, colleagues.
Good meeting. See you later.